On February 12, 2009, at approximately 10:17 p.m. Eastern Time, Colgan Air Flight 3407 fell from the sky over Clarence Center, New York, killing all 49 people on board and one person on the ground. The aircraft was a Bombardier -8 Q400 turboprop operating as continental connection flight from Newark to Buffalo. The first officer had commuted overnight from Seattle, sleeping in the crew lounge at Newark because she couldn't afford housing near her base. The captain did not have adequate rest either. The National Transportation Safety Board determined the probable cause was the captain's inappropriate response to a stick shaker activation, a basic aerodynamic stall warning that students pilot learn to handle in their first weeks of training. For decades prior to that crash, America had quietly accepted a painful truth about its regional aviation system. Small cities needed air service, but small cities couldn't fill large planes. The solution was smaller aircraft, flown by cheaper pilots, working for carriers most passengers had never heard of. The economics seemed elegant, the human costs seemed invisible. Then, 50 people died outside Buffalo, and the entire architecture of American regional aviation was forced to change. But here's what makes no sense about what happened next. The tragedy didn't kill the regional jet, it made regional jets more dominant than ever. Today, regional carriers operate roughly 1/3 of all scheduled US departures and provide the only air service to approximately 63% of American airports. The CRJ and Embraer ERJ families didn't just survive the post-crash reckoning, they conquered the country. Yet the aircraft that fly those routes, the number of seats they carry, even the weight they're allowed to reach at takeoff, none of that was determined by engineers, passengers, or market demand. It was determined by union contracts. So, how did a labor negotiation clause reshape the entire American sky? To understand why regional jets took over, you need to understand what they replaced and why passengers hated it. Throughout the 1980s, following the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978, major carriers like Delta, United, and American built hub-and-spoke networks. They needed smaller partner airlines to funnel passengers from places like Wichita, Appleton, and Williamsport into hubs at Dallas, Chicago, and Atlanta. Those partner airlines flew turboprops, Saab 340s, Embraer Bracillas, Beech 1900s, de Havilland -8s. Passengers despised them. Turboprops were loud, they vibrated, they flew at lower altitudes through more turbulence. They had propellers visible from window seats, which created an irrational but powerful psychological effect. Passengers saw propellers and thought of danger. They saw jet engines and thought of safety. The perception was wrong. Turboprops are mechanically reliable and far more fuel efficient on short routes than jets. But perception drives purchasing decisions, and passengers were actively avoiding turboprop itineraries. The airlines needed a jet small enough for Wichita, but fast enough for the passenger who refused to board a propeller aircraft. That jet didn't exist yet in the 1990s. Then, on May 10, 1991, something happened in Montreal that would eventually shape every airport in America. Bombardier flew the prototype of the Canadair regional jet, the CRJ-100, for the first time. The aircraft was derived from the Challenger 600 business jet, essentially a stretched executive plane. The result was 50 seats crammed into a narrow fuselage. It wasn't spacious, the windows sat at knee level. The overhead bins were barely functional. The cabin width measured just over 8 feet. But it was a jet. Lufthansa CityLine became the launch customer in 1992. Then on June 1, 1993, Comair, a Delta connection carrier, introduced the CRJ to American passengers. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Routes that had struggled with turboprop loads suddenly filled. Passengers who had been driving 4 hours to larger airports returned to their local fields. Embraer watched from São José dos Campos, Brazil, and responded in 1996 with the ERJ-145, another 50-seat jet, but with a different fuselage geometry and slightly different economics. Together, the CRJ and ERJ families created an entirely new category, The regional jet wasn't a smaller airliner, it was a business jet stretched into airline service, designed to make 50 passengers feel like they were flying something real. By the late 1990s, every major US carrier was ordering them aggressively. Mesa Air Group, originally a turboprop operator flying Beech 1900s across the Southwest, began transitioning to ERJs and CRJs, eventually phasing out its Dash 8 turboprops by 2011. Commute Air made the same transition, retiring its last Dash 8 Q300 in September 2017 and its Q200 fleet in January 2018. Carrier after carrier replaced propellers with jets. Not because jets were more efficient on those routes, they weren't, but because passengers would pay to avoid propellers, and airlines would pay to capture those passengers. The regional jet hadn't supplemented the turboprop, it had annihilated it. But here's where this entire story takes a direction most people never consider. The regional jet revolution wasn't just driven by passenger preference, it was engineered by a financial arbitrage that depended entirely on one obscure provision buried in pilot union contracts. It's called a scope clause. A scope clause is a section of a collective bargaining agreement between a major airline and its pilot union. In the US, typically represented by the Airline Pilots Association, or ALPA. The clause defines the boundary between mainline flying, performed by the major airline's own pilots, and regional flying, outsourced to cheaper subsidiary or contract carriers. The scope clause determines how many regional jets can operate under a major carrier's brand. It determines the maximum number of seats those jets can carry, and critically, it determines the maximum takeoff weight of those aircraft. In the 1990s and early 2000s, scope clauses were relatively loose compared to those for aircraft on the market. Major airlines exploited this aggressively. A mainline captain at Delta or United might earn $200,000 annually. A first officer at a regional subsidiary flying the same passengers under the same brand earned $16,000 to $25,000. The economics were obvious. By outsourcing flying to lower-cost regional operators, airlines dramatically reduced costs while keeping the same network and branding. Airlines didn't just outsource thin markets, they outsourced competitive ones. Mesa Air Group even created a subsidiary called Freedom Airlines, specifically to operate jets for US Airways, while bypassing scope restrictions that the mainline pilots had negotiated. The pilots' union fought back, and after US Airways lifted its scope restrictions and settled with the union, Mesa merged Freedom back into the parent company in 2003. The scope clause became the central battleground of American aviation labor relations. Mainline pilots saw regional jets as a direct threat. Every 50-seat jet flying a profitable route was a seat that a mainline pilot should have been filling in a 737 or A320. Unions demanded tighter restrictions, and in the 2010s, following years of acrimonious negotiations at Delta, United, and American, the industry settled on limits that remain largely unchanged today. 76 seats maximum, 86,000 pounds maximum takeoff weight, hard caps on the total number of large regional jets each carrier could operate. United was limited to 255 large regional jets. Delta was capped at 102 jets with 70 seats, and 153 jets with 76 seats. American restricted outsourced large regional jets to 40% of its mainline narrowbody fleet size. These numbers weren't chosen by aeronautical engineers, they were chosen by labor negotiators, and they would dictate which aircraft could exist in the American market for the next decade and beyond. The scope clause didn't just limit fleet size, it shaped aircraft design itself. Bombardier and Embraer both developed larger regional jets to fill the 70 to 76 seat category that scope clauses permitted. Bombardier offered the CRJ-700 and CRJ-900. Embraer countered with the E-170 and E-175. The E-175 won decisively. From 2013 to 2017, Embraer booked nearly 400 E-175 orders in the United States, outselling the CRJ-900 by a ratio of 4-1. The reason was straightforward. Embraer designed the E-Jet family with a double-bubble fuselage cross-section, offering wider seats at 18.25 inches compared to 17 inches on the CRJ. larger overhead bins, and a cabin that felt closer to a mainline narrowbody than a stretched business jet. Critically, the E175's maximum takeoff weight came in at approximately 85,500 pounds, fitting just under the 86,000 pound scope limit. This was not coincidence. This was engineered by union contract. The aircraft was designed to comply with a labor agreement, not an aerodynamic optimum. And here lies the paradox that defines American regional aviation today. The E175 is the only new-build commercial aircraft that complies with current scope clauses. Bombardier exited commercial aviation entirely in 2020, selling the CRJ program to Mitsubishi. The Mitsubishi SpaceJet, which was intended to compete directly with the E175, was cancelled in 2023, in part because its primary M90 variant couldn't meet US scope restrictions, alongside massive cost overruns and repeated certification delays. Embraer's own next-generation aircraft, the E175-E2, features more efficient geared turbofan engines that would save significant fuel. But the aircraft is heavier. The E175-E2 has a maximum takeoff weight of 98,120 pounds, exceeding the scope limit by over 12,000 pounds. Embraer has officially paused the program, with entry into service not expected until at least 2027 or 2028, explicitly citing US scope clauses as a primary reason. A labor contract, written in the 2010s, has effectively frozen American regional aircraft technology in place. The most fuel-efficient replacement for the current fleet cannot be purchased because it weighs too much for a union agreement to permit. The consequences of this freeze extend far beyond airline boardrooms. The 50-seat jets that launched the regional revolution, the CRJ-200s and ERJ-145s, are approaching economic extinction. They haven't been manufactured in years. Operating them requires 2 pilots, the same crew complement as a 76-seat E175, but across 26 fewer revenue seats. When oil prices spiked to $147 per barrel in 2008, the fuel burn per passenger on a 50-seater became catastrophic. Regional pilot pay has surged from roughly $25,000 starting salary to approximately $100,000 or more today, driven partly by the 1,500-hour rule Congress imposed after the Colgan crash. That rule requires first officers to accumulate 1,500 flight hours before flying commercially, up from 250 hours previously. The pipeline of cheap pilots that had sustained regional economics for 2 decades evaporated almost overnight. As 50-seaters retire, the communities they serve face a stark choice. Either generate enough demand to justify a 76-seat E175, or lose air service entirely. In states like West Virginia, Alaska, North Dakota, and Vermont, where regional airlines provide over 70% of air service, the 50-seat retirement wave represents an existential threat to connectivity. A clean-sheet 50-seat jet has not been produced in years, with scope clause requirements remaining at its limits. No aircraft manufacturer wants to tackle this market, which would be limited. Airlines had to get creative. United even became the launch customer for the CRJ-550, a 50-seat reconfiguration of the larger CRJ-700, specifically to offer a premium product with first-class seats, while technically staying within scope clause fleet caps for the 50-seat category. It's an elegant workaround and an absurd one simultaneously. An airline deliberately reducing an aircraft's capacity to comply with a labor agreement, then marketing the reduced capacity as a luxury product. Faye Black, CEO of the Regional Airline Association, has warned that when airlines move to larger planes for secondary reasons, including to drive down costs or stay compliant with union contract clauses, the results are often problematic for the communities that need service most. The aviation industry has always measured success in routes served, passengers carried, and fleet size, but the story of regional jets in America reveals something different. The most consequential decisions in American aviation weren't made by engineers at aircraft manufacturers' offices. They were made by executives in Chicago or Atlanta. They were made by labor negotiators in hotel conference rooms, arguing over maximum takeoff weight limits denominated in pounds. The scope clause didn't just shape which aircraft Americans fly, it determined which aircraft manufacturers survived. killing the Mitsubishi SpaceJet and pausing the E175-E2. It determined which cities kept air service and which lost it. It determined that the majority of American airports would depend entirely on carriers most passengers cannot name. The passengers boarding those flights almost never know which pilots are flying them, whose maintenance crews service the aircraft, or which labor contract determined that the jet has exactly 76 seats and weighs no more than 86,000 pounds. The regional jet didn't win America through superior technology. Turboprops remain more efficient on short routes. It didn't win through passenger satisfaction. The CRJ-200 is arguably the most reviled aircraft in commercial aviation. Windows at knee level, overhead bins that reject standard roller bags, a fuselage passengers have called the devil's chariot, and it certainly didn't win through rational economic planning. The system now faces a replacement crisis with no compliant new aircraft available for purchase. Regional jets won America because they sat at the intersection of three powerful forces: passenger psychology that demanded jet engines, airline economics that demanded cheap labor, and union contracts that demanded boundaries. The scope clause was the invisible hand that built the fleet, city by city, seat by seat, pound by pound. The question isn't whether regional jets changed American aviation. They already did, profoundly and perhaps irreversibly. The question is whether the same labor agreements that created this system can adapt before it collapses under its own contradictions, and whether the rest of the industry is really paying attention. Hey, before you go, the YouTube algorithm thinks you're going to like this video next, so why not check it out?